All right, so today, we're going to start off with doing freedom of speech. And we're going to start in a very particularized area of freedom of speech, and those are sort of national security exceptions. There's a reason why freedom of speech is in the First Amendment and first among the First Amendment. It is because the founders thought of it as the most important amendment possible. That if speech was not protected from government intrusion, really what was the point? Of having a democracy to begin with. There simply wasn't one. But we're going to learn throughout this class, in this section, that there are many, many ways in which Congress and the states can actually pass laws that do abridge freedom of speech. And that's because freedom of speech is not absolute. And so these limitations have to fall under certain exceptions. And the one that we're going to be covering today is a national security exception. The Supreme Court has created pretty much as a hierarchy that the First Amendment is among the most prominent. Justice Holmes, who you become very familiar with in the form of this class, wrote in United States v. Swimmer that if there is any principle of the Constitution that more imperatively calls for attachment than any other, it is the principle of free thought. Not for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. And so this kind of Holmes's jurisprudence in this area, which you will see develop through the course of this class, or literally this class, today's class, largely becomes the jurisprudence of the United States Supreme Court, more or less going forward. Holmes is probably one of the I don't want to call him an architect because he didn't create the First Amendment, but he's one of the defining authors who's written on the First Amendment and has really guided a lot of how the court currently and over time, starting in the early 1900s, views the First Amendment. So when we get to the of freedom and national security, we have to understand that there are periods, really speed bumps in time, that sort of affect this balance between free speech and national security. And it's not like it took us a long time to get to one of these areas. The first being the Alien Sedition Acts. The Alien Sedition Acts were passed in 1798. And what it did, the Alien Sedition Acts, is it criminalized certain types of dissent against the federal government. And during this time period, 10 newspaper editors were convicted for publishing their viewpoints. And this law during this time period absolutely doesn't get challenged. This law, if it were passed today, would absolutely be declared unconstitutional. But in our nascent nation at the time, these sorts of rules were not uncommon. And it's not as though early on was any different from later on. So President Lincoln also uses an extremely heavy hand to suppress dissent during the Civil War. But almost none of these cases make it to the United States Supreme Court. I think we'll cover one that makes it all the way to the United States Supreme Court from Lincoln's area. And what we find out and what we'll see in the jurisprudence through today is there's a really difficult balance to be struck between protecting national security and protecting free speech. In World War I, the U.S. made its first real strong effort to suppress speech since really the espionage, or since really the Alien and Sedition Acts. Congress really doesn't enter into this area until 1917 with the passage of the Espionage Act, which made it a crime to interfere with or obstruct military recruitment and morale. So the Espionage Act sort of sticks out as the starting point for Congress to begin to regulate in these areas. This regulation continues through World War II, and even further, when you think of the McCarthyism era through the communist quote unquote scare of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. What was difficult through all of this time period, and one of the things that we're going to focus on in this national security section, was developing a test to actually detect when the federal government had gone too far, or any government had gone too far in terms of restricting speech with a balance towards national security. And the development of a test which courts could apply to any law which restricted speech in the area of national security proved something fairly difficult, something that had considerate debate over, and even Supreme Court justices changing their mind over time about what was the applicable method by which to judge these distinctions that Congress and states were making with regard to speech to balance it against national security. Now, national security as a justification is usually a very high bar for individuals to get over. Laws that exist to protect our national security can and often do trump other rights that we would understand we have. Free speech being among them. If your speech advocates for the violent overthrow of the country has an interest in seeing itself continued and prosperous. And in those circumstances, when the speech has a possibility of advocating for actions that might be successful, then the government does have an interest in suppressing that speech. But this balance that we're going to see play out is really going to be about determining whether the action that is being advocated for in the speech has a likelihood of occurring. And that's really how these tests sort of shift over time. So the way to think about these tests, and there's 3 of them, are evolving in this nature to identify the likelihood of the event occurring. So the first test that we're going to cover is the clear and present danger test, which Justice Holmes advocates for in Schenck. And this test is the first attempt of the Supreme Court to come up with a scheme to judge these sorts of laws. Later on in Brandenburg v. Ohio, the court comes up with its imminent lawless action test. And this imminent lawless action test looks a lot like Holmes's evolving jurisprudence in this area. And we'll see what I mean today, because we're going to see how Holmes evolves over time, sometimes very quickly. And the last test in this area is a simple balancing test, where we balance the interests of the speaker against the interests of national security. And we balance the likelihood of that action against national security. And this this test occurs in black. So all of these tests, after the clear and present danger test, have at their core this idea of, is what the speakers are advocating for likely to occur or possible to occur? Because it could be one thing to simply advocate for what would be a seditionist act, to simply advocate for it. And it would be another to advocate for it in a climate in which that act could likely occur. And so these tests sort of recognize those differences.